All right, let's learn how to create custom exceptions with Spring Boot. So in here, let's go ahead and inside of this exception package, let's create a new class, and we're going to call this as API and then request and then exception. There we go. So full screen here. So this will extend runtime exception. And here, let's have a constructor. So in fact, let's just say override. And basically we want to override these two constructors, just like that. So one with message and the other one that has the message as well as the throwable. So this is the actual cause. Now let's go ahead and create another class. So this is the exception that we're going to throw in a second. Now let's go ahead and create another class here. So we're going to create a new class, and this will be the actual exception that the client will receive. So API and then exception. So for this class, we want to have the message. So string, or actually private, and then final string message. We also want the throwable. So private, final, and then throwable. And you'll see all of this in action in a second. We also want the private, final, and then HTTP and then status. So you've learned about HTTP status. So there we go. Oops, not that. So status, and then the HTTP status. And let's also have the private and then final, and then the the actual date. So zoned date time and then zone date time, right? So now we need to have the boilerplate. So add all of these to constructor, just like that. And basically I'm going to show you Lombok in a second to avoid all of this boilerplate code. So there we go. Now let's have the getter. So getter for all of these. And we also need the toString. So toString and all of those. There we go. So we have the API exception, and this is what the client will see. Now let's create another class. So I know we are creating many classes, but this class is the final class where it will be the class that will handle exceptions. So here I'm going to say exception and then handler. So here we can actually handle multiple exceptions. So in this class, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to have, so let me put this full screen. So here we're going to have a public, so public, and then we're going to say response. So response and then entity, and this will be an object. So this is what we're going to use to build the response to our client. So response entity and then of type object. So in here we're going to pass our custom, so this class right here that we've just built, API exception. So let me just collapse that, and here I'm going to say handle and then API and then request exception. So exception, and in here we're going to receive the API exception, and then I'm going to say API exception. And inside of this method right here, we have to do a couple of things. So one, we want to return. So here, let me just code this backwards so you see exactly. So we want to return new and then response entity. And then inside of the response entity, if I press Command P, you can see that we have the status, we have the body. So the body is actually an object, right? And then we have the status as well. We can pass a multi-map and basically other options as well, right? So what we want is to pass the API exception. So API exception here, and then some status code. So for this, let's go ahead and say that this is a bad request. So bad and then request. And let me put this just like this. in here. And let me actually rename this. So this API exception cannot be this one. So here we're going to say E. So this is what the client, so this is what the client for this method passes. And we have to build this API exception here. So here, let's see if we can create. So yeah, so create a local variable. And this is API and then exception. And that will be API exception equals to and the new API exception. Now inside we can pass the message, right? So the message will be, so here I'm going to say E dot and then get message from this exception that we throw. And then we want to pass the throwable. So I actually realized that this is not API exception. So this should be API and then request exception. So this is the actual exception, right? So this exception here is this one that we've just created. And this is basically what this method will handle. So handle API request exception, and it takes API request exception. So next, what we need is to pass the status code. So here, I said bad request. So we could actually omit that from the API exception class, but we can include it there. And then finally, we want to pass the zone date time. So I'm going to say zone date time and then now. And there we go. So if I indent this, and you can see that we have this method, handle API request exception, takes the exception that is going to handle, builds the payload for our client, and then we send the response right here using the response entity. So this is pretty much all we have to do. Now, this in itself, it's not going to work. And that's because we have to use 2 extra annotations. And that's what I'm going to show you next. But at this point, so we actually have 3 classes. So API exception. So this is what the client will see. So you'll see this in a second. API request exception. So this is what we're going to throw from our code. So API request exception. And then we have the exception handler. So this is a way of us handling more than one exception. Next, let me go ahead and teach you about 2 important annotations that will allow us to send custom exceptions to our clients.